Okay, now that we covered Module 7 Overview, I'd like to go over the chapter itself, talk about the content of the chapter and more of an overview using PowerPoint as we do typically every time we meet. So let's do that. Try to keep these slide presentations short and hit the high points so this way we can get to our hands-on stuff. Okay. All right, so in this chapter, the outcomes are talking about something called a float. It's a property. We're also going to be talking about positioning, fixed, relative, absolute, how we can position elements where we want. Two-column layout, our unordered lists, which is now going to be our navigation, and then our pseudo classes and our sprites and what the heck they are, right? Great. There we go. All right, so far, what we've been working with, and this has to do with positioning and such, and absolute and so on and so forth, absolute positioning and relative positioning, is understanding what's called normal flow. You've been working in normal flow so far. You didn't have to do anything about it. We've been doing it, okay? Because normal flow is the browser simply displays in order your HTML. Starting from the top, right after the body, it displays whatever's in, right? The element that's there, which is now what? The wrapper at this point, right? It starts to formulate that. Then it displays the header. Then it displays whatever's inside that. And then it displays the nav and whatever's inside that. Then it goes to, and now the div that we have, right, to display that nice little hero graphic. And then from there, it displays the main and everything inside that in order as it appears, right, and how it's written in the page. That's what's called normal flow, okay? We don't have to do anything about it. It's just what the browser does, okay? Now, what's important here is that as we start to manipulate, right, our elements and where they appear, okay, using relative or absolute positioning, that changes things, okay? So we all have to consider the normal flow and where objects are presented to us within normal flow, and that's going to help us out. We'll have an example of what the difference is in just a moment, okay? And when we talk about absolute value and stuff like, or absolute and relative. All right, so one of the properties that we'll get very comfortable with is something called the float property, okay? And what that allows us to do is actually float an element to the right or to the left, okay, on the page, within the element that it's in, okay? And what this does is it essentially takes all the rest of the content and slides it up. It essentially allows us to wrap text, right? So if we have a graphic, which in normal flow is on the left-hand side, right? When we apply float right to this graphic, it slides to the right-hand side of the page, and then all the rest of the content slides up next to it, essentially wrapping that graphic with text. So if this particular example had more content, more text that went further past the graphic, right? Where would that text appear? Would it appear straight down, or would it wrap underneath the graphic? Wrap underneath. So that's what this float allows us to do, okay? So it's a really nice feature, right? Nice property we have. And it's right here. So if we look at the actual code that we have, H1 has a whole bunch of styling. That's why it's got that green background, the Times Roman, or the color that it has, right? The text color that it has, and a little bit of padding. The paragraph simply has an assigned font. And then the graphic there has a border, right? Or I should say a margin and a border, and then it floats to the right. And that's why we see that graphic to the right. No. Actually, you want 0. None will not work, right? Yeah. So, and we don't have to do all 4. We only have to do 1, right? Because then that takes care of all of the sides of our box model. Yeah, very good. Okay. So, that's float. We'll be using that a lot. Okay. Or you'll be using that a lot as well. All right. Although there are a couple other items on the list here as we go through the chapter, there's something called clear and there's something called overflow. And we'll cover those when we do our hands-on. Okay? Now, we currently have on our case study a one-column, right, page, one column. What we want to do is we want to take that one column and create a multi-column page. Okay? There's really not much different than we do to our standard structure. Our structure looks exactly the same. We simply use CSS to position, right, our elements where we want. For example, in this case, navigation is no longer horizontal or, right, above main. We've now pushed nav to the left-hand side. Okay? We're doing this with CSS. Okay? And this is a very simple way to create a multi-column layout. Okay? The layout, the structure is still the same. We simply use CSS to push things here or there. All right, the navigation, right? I talked about how we're going to be changing the way we develop our navigational lists, okay? Prior to this module, our navigation used the nav element and then simply had anchor elements with spaces in between. It was always horizontal, our navigation, unless we used the break element, right after the anchor, and that created a simulated vertical list. Yeah, we don't want to do that. What we really want to use is a list. In this case, because the W3C has not approved the LL, which is the link list, okay, we're going to be using the unordered list, which is the standard in the industry at this point, right? So when we have a list of links, we want to use a UL element, an unordered list. And all of the LIs are going to be your links, okay? Now, if we simply build it as this slide or this card deck in the PowerPoint file looks, we will come up with something that appears on the right-hand side. It's going to have bullets, because that's what a UL does, and it's going to have underlines, which is not really the nicest looking link list, okay? We might want to look at something that looks similar to what's at the bottom right side, bottom corner of our slide, right? No bullets and no underline, okay? So the way we do this is we use CSS, okay? We have a descendant selector to style and remove the bullets from the UL. Why do we use a descendant selector? Why not just use UL? Thank you. What if I have a set of other bullets on my page? If I do, well, then I'm going to mess those up as well. So I want to use a descendant selector, so I'm only styling the ULs within the nav, right? Cool. And then we have an anchor, right? It's a descendant selector, same concept. We don't want to affect the other anchors, so anything that's inside the nav, then we're going to get rid of the underline. And so 2 lines of CSS to create something that looks like on the right-hand side. No bullets and no underline. Okay. Now, we still have the issue of it being vertical, because by default, a bullet list is vertical, right? How do I go about making my vertical list horizontal, right? And we simply add one additional property, right? One additional rule, okay? The coding is exactly the same. We use nav, we use UL, we use LIs. It's exactly the same as we code it. But the CSS, we add one more line, and it's in yellow right here, okay? Of course, we're using our descendant selector, and we style the LI to simply display in line. Okay? What does that mean, in line? I know we talk about it. We talked about block level, right? We talked about inline. What's the difference? What does inline mean? What does block mean? When somebody says, oh, that's a block level element, what are they saying? This means that there's going to be a line break above and below the element. So, name out some block level elements that you're aware of already. Thank you. What else? Div. Paragraph. LI. You get a new line every time we have a bullet. Okay? What else? Header. Nav. Footer. Main. There's a lot of these out there. Right? And they're all block level because they get a brand new, right, line above and below. So you don't see them next to each other. You see them underneath each other. That's block level. Okay? When we see things next to each other, that means that they're styled by default the display inline. So name some inline elements that you are aware of. How about the anchor element? It's inline. You put two next to each other and you'll see two links next to each other, not one and then the next, right, below each other. So anchors are by default inline because they're just right next to each other. What else? I know we don't use these anymore now because we've graduated. But what about those phrase elements? Strong, right? EM, B, I. Bless you. Right? How about span? Span is, right, the number one inline element that we have. Okay? So all we do is simply convert what was block into inline, and now they'll be right next to each other. They won't get a brand new line, right, when there's a new element of the same kind. Make sense? All right. Fantastic. Let's move on. Whoa, too far. All right, pseudo-classes. These are really cool. So pseudo-classes, think of them as sub-properties of an element, okay, or subclasses. We have, let's see, 5 to work with. You already are familiar with the first one, link. It's blue by default. You're already familiar with the visited. It's purple by default, okay? These other ones you've used, but you didn't really know that they were there, perhaps. Focus, that's the one that focus is one. We don't really talk about too much here, but we also talk about hover. When you take that mouse and you hover over the link, it doesn't do anything at this point, but we can make it do something if we want. You've probably seen that already. The underline disappears, it changes color, right? Something happens in the background when you hover over a link. Okay, that's hover. Okay? You've used it, but really nothing has changed. By default, it's the same as the link. And then active. Okay, it's been there. Didn't really realize it was there, but that's red. That's that time in between the link and in between visited. It's considered active. Okay, so we can actually style all 5 of these pseudo classes. Okay, the most fun one is the hover, because when you move that mouse over an element, you can make it do something. Okay, so it almost creates an interactivity environment for us. Okay, cool. So very neat. So these are pseudo classes. We'll learn these in this module as well. Now, positional properties. So there are values for the position property to allow us to position elements where we want on the page, okay? And it's within the element that it's in, okay? So that's how we essentially style it. We choose a position, and wherever that position or that element is in, it positions it within the container that it's in, right? Its parent container. Now, there are 4 values. One is static, which you hardly ever see because it's the default, and nobody actually writes that one out. Okay? You have fixed. How many of you have ever been to a website that when you scroll down, the navigation follows you? That's fixed. Okay? If it disappears, well then it's just a normal flow, right? You're just scrolling down. But fixed essentially says stick it right here and don't move it. So when they scroll up and down, it gives the simulated environment that, wow, it's actually following me. But it's really not. It's just sitting in one spot, and you're moving. Right? Yeah. Relative. Relative is the position that the element is in based on normal flow. Right? So based on the normal flow, one item after the other, we can reposition that element based on the normal flow. Okay? And then we have absolute. Okay? This essentially disregards normal flow and says, you know what? I don't really care about you, normal flow. I'm going to take this object and I'm going to put it wherever I want. And everything else slides up and creates its own, right, revised normal flow. Okay? So it takes that element out of normal flow and puts it wherever it is that you want within the container that it's in. Okay? Let me show you an example. So here is a file that has no styling other than the default styling from the browser. We have a heading, we have a paragraph, and we have a bullet list. Okay. It has now been styled. Just some simple styling. We styled the H2, we styled the paragraph, and well, we didn't really do much to the UL there. But let's talk a little bit about the paragraph there. Why is it all condensed? What did we do? What did we apply to that paragraph to make it look like this as opposed to all the way out to the sides? Nope. Nope. How wide is it now? Width, right? So all we did was set a width to the paragraph so it doesn't go further than what we want it to, okay? Now, this is normal flow. It's coded this way. H2, paragraph, and then the bullet list. I applied now a positional property, relative positioning. I gave it relative positioning, so many pixels from the top, so many pixels from the left. And it is now positioned in that particular location based on normal flow. So based on where it would normally be in normal flow, move it 100 pixels from the left and 50 pixels from the top. Again, based on normal flow. That's what this example shows. Now, let's say I replace relative positioning with absolute positioning. Notice the difference. The absolute positioned object or element disregards normal flow and simply puts it, right, and says, okay, I'm going to disregard you, and now I'm going to be positioned outside of that. And I'm just going to take a look and say, okay, it'll be 100. Boom, that's where I should be regardless of normal flow, right? So I don't care about normal flow and where it normally is in normal flow. I simply say, give it to me 100 pixels from the left and 50 pixels from the top. I'm good to go. Notice how everything else slides up, right? Not necessarily a very simple concept to understand initially, but it's one you'll have to learn, and you'll get more familiar as you work with the position property. Okay? But I thought this example might help kind of put some sort of context to that property. Okay. All right, and then the last thing we're going to talk about is image sprites or CSS sprites. This is a sample, a very simple sample of one file that contains two graphics in it, right? Two images in it. And what it does is, if we look on the right-hand side, is it currently displays the top version, right? The white version of the lighthouse in the links. But when someone hovers over it, notice the little hand, when someone hovers over it, the graphic actually moves, right, and displays the darker version. That's a CSS sprite. Okay? Let me show you an example of a site that has CSS sprites. A lot of websites have them. Okay? So we're going to go to Blackboard. Now, what's a nice way to find out and to see these different graphics on the site, you might start to consider installing or adding in the web dev toolbar. So Firefox, you can add in some really cool tools and stuff. And one of them that you can use for web development is the web dev toolbar for Firefox. Okay. Now, I'm going to use that toolbar to display images. Okay. So under images, there's a view image information option. This gives me a separate page of all the graphics that are on this page. Okay. And we're going to scroll down until we find a image sprite. Bingo. There it is. Look at that. One graphic file, right? One file that contains multiple graphics, multiple images. Okay. How many of you have ever done that before, right? Where you have to choose how really cool it is, right? A rating system, 1 star, 2 stars, or some other, right, thing. Maybe 3 beers, 4 beers if you're on a beer site, right? How good is it? Well, this essentially is how they do it, right? as you hover over the second star, it displays 2 stars of that image sprite. You go over 3 stars, it displays 3 stars of that image sprite, right? And that's how they do this kind of stuff, right? So notice the little icons that we have here. Again, these are all, and notice how organized they are. That's the important part too. By creating a file and having them in a grid system, it's easy to identify, right, what pixel they are within the graphic themselves. Okay? Yeah. It's not something very easy to get accustomed to doing, but it's a pretty old technology and it's still pretty useful. And many, many pages still use them, right? It's still current in the industry, so that this hasn't changed in a long time. But you'll learn how to do on a pretty simple one, like an example that I showed you in this chapter, just to give you a sense of how it works. Okay? And this will be the example that you'll be creating. And we'll try to get to it tonight. So I think one of the last things we do in this in our hands-on tonight. So I'm hoping we can get to it. Any questions about the chapter? Now, this last slide is really just trying to remind you that CSS coding is not the easiest thing in the world, right? And I would hope that you have a little bit of patience because it can get frustrating, especially when it's not working and you think that it should, right? So here are some debugging techniques you might want to consider. First, of course, visually look at the code and see if you can find something that jumps out at you. A missing curly brace, right? A missing semicolon or something like that, or a missing colon. Second, you're going to validate that page. Make sure that it's valid. At least you got all the, the I's crossed and the T's dotted. Everybody awake for that one? Okay, maybe not. Then, if that doesn't help, I think we discussed this in a previous chapter. You may want to consider changing some of the properties of those rules to see what gets affected, right? So a background color will really help identify where an object or an element is on the page and how much space it takes up. A border would also do basically the same thing, right? Let me show you this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about border. If I go back to my example here, right, and I use outline and block level, I now can see where the outlines of my elements are. So by changing the border of an element, you can now see kind of where it's at. So notice how this one no longer jets across the whole screen. It's smaller because we applied a width to it. And so now it's no longer the entire width of the browser. It's only so many pixels wide, right? And that's kind of what I'm talking about, where you can really see now the things that are invisible to you just by looking at the browser. Okay. The other thing that might help is putting some comments in, right? Putting some comments in to help not only you, but your colleagues, right? Identify perhaps some code that should stay that way or some other reason, right? Yeah. You can even comment out code to test, right? You just put in one declaration and for some reason your whole page went haywire. So comment out the page or the declaration and see if it goes back to where it was. If it doesn't, that means that maybe that error is a little bit further back than you thought, right? Comment out another declaration and another and perhaps a whole rule and see what happens, right? So it's really a matter of troubleshooting, right, and debugging, okay? So just be patient and it will come as you start to work more and more with CSS. Any questions or anything about these debugging techniques or anything we covered in the slides? No? Okay. Great then. Let's get back to here and take a look at what we've covered. Fantastic. Okay. Very good.